I will begin by introducing myself and Barry. Yeah, let's begin this here. Okay, so welcome to this webinar from the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism called Smear and State Violence from Nazi Anti-Semitism to U.S. Anti-Palestinian Rhetoric. Our speaker is Barry Trachtenberg, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I'm going to start by talking just very briefly about why we're looking at smear. So the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is a research education organization and research community. It's just a little over a year and a half old, which correctly, your math is correct. It puts our launch right at the beginning of the genocide. And our job is to look at how Zionism works, operates, how it was built, and to try and understand it as a power structure. And the reason, obviously, that we need to create an institute to do that is that it's very hard to do that in the context of the academy, given the sort of outsized role of Zionist donors and the ways that the study of Zionism has been kind of bounded into spheres of Jewish studies and Israel studies, which are themselves funded often by Zionist donors directly connected to the Israeli state, et cetera. So that's what the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is. And the reason that we have recently taken up the idea of researching smear and Zionist hate mail is partly because we've all been so subjected to them, and partly because the long history that we all are familiar with of being smeared every time we talk about Palestine or every time we try to look at Zionism as a politics or an ideology or a power structure. The smears come out that call us anti-Semitic or terror supporting, or take other forms like impugning our scholarship, or saying that we're funded by Qatar, which would be great, but we're not, and generally trying to sort of destabilize the project of looking critically at how Zionism is working and to silence discussion of Palestinian lives and experiences and to paper over the Israeli colonial project. So smear is a material weapon for doing that. It has been a weapon for a long time, but in the present moment, as it is sort of coinciding and intertwining with the rising US fascism, the effects and the material power of smear has become much more serious. So we're going to talk about that. And Barry Trachtenberg is our expert in genocide studies, who is going to give us some sort of comparative thinking about that, so that we are not stuck only in the present, but we're trying to understand these things in a broader view, in a longer way. So I'll introduce Barry, he'll give a talk, and then I will ask him a few questions. But throughout, you're all welcome to put questions in the chat or comments. And then when it comes to the time where we're going to talk about them, I will try and pull some out, and Barry can pull some out too. And we'll see how we can sort of build this into a more collaborative discussion. So with that, let me introduce Barry. Barry Trachtenberg serves on the academic board of Jewish Voice for Peace and the advisory board of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. He's a historian of modern European and American Jewry and the author of 3 books, The Holocaust and the Exile of Yiddish, A History of the Allgemeine Encyclopedia, The United States and the Holocaust, Race, Refuge, and Remembrance, and The Revolutionary Roots of Modern Yiddish from 1903 to 1917. He holds the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish History at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. His writings on Zionism, anti-Semitism, and U.S. support for Israel have appeared in forums including Jewish Currents, The Forward, Tablet, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, Die Tageszeitung, oh, this is challenging my pronunciations, Alarm, and La Razón. In 2017, he testified to the U.S. Congress on the topic of anti-Semitism in college and university classrooms. And he's been an expert witness in lots of additional cases. And we're really, really lucky to have him with us, just not only today, but in general. So let's hear from Barry. And then when he's done, I'll come back with some questions and we'll pull from the chat as well. Thanks so much. Barry.
Thank you. The honor is really mine. I am going to share my screen here. All right. Are you able to see that? All right. Okay, good. Thank you. Um, so I would like to start this discussion by actually talking about some of the hate mail that I have received over the years. As a scholar of Jewish history and the Nazi Holocaust who has come to understand that the most, or come to believe that the most consistently ethical position is to oppose racial and religious supremacy, colonial violence, mass displacement, and genocide, regardless of who are the perpetrators or the victims. I've received a fair share of hate mail and public smears over the course of my career. Sometimes it comes from the Jewish press, such as these pieces here from the Allgemeiner, the one that says anti-Israel professor hijacks a Holocaust conference is quite funny because I was the one who had organized that particular conference. Sometimes they come from unsolicited emails that I've received. So these are ones I've received over the last year and a half or so from people. I don't know who they are, but you can see both of them are calling me a traitor in different ways. I was a Nazi sympathizer, traitor to your people, and so on. Um, I always like to name who's doing it here. So this was a nice Instagram post I received in the wake of the cancellation of the talk by our dear friend and a founding member of the Institute, Rabab Al-Duhadi, who was supposed to speak on my campus last October. And so you can see that these people are saying that I'm dangerous. I do not represent the state. I do not represent the region, and so on. Um, Here's this Logan Levkov, who's a sort of a regular hater on Twitter. It's calling me, unsafe and endangering the Jewish community on my campus, and so on. So these are just some of them. But what I would like to talk about for a second is, what are the function that these types of smears are supposed to serve? I think it's useful to sort of pause and think about this for a moment. Much of it has to do with the goal of trying to alienate me, to sideline me, marginalize me, by making it clear that I am somehow not representative of the Jewish people, that I don't represent a mainstream position, to say that my point of view is illegitimate and that it really has no place in the public sphere. Also see that it's an attempt to question my credentials and at some basic level to excommunicate me, which was basically something that happened several years ago in our local synagogue when on Yom Kippur, the rabbi made it clear without naming me, but that I had basically walked away from the Jewish people because of my criticism of the state of Israel. Most of all, though, I think it is an attempt to deny my authority to speak from my area of my professional expertise because it runs contrary to their politics. It challenges their assumptions and beliefs. And of course, they believe that because I am both Jewish and a historian of the Jewish past, that I must reach the same conclusions that they hold about Israel, Zionism, and the so-called lessons of the Holocaust, and of course, the danger that's posed by Palestinians. Um, and in doing so, what we see this is very much an inversion of the traditional place of the expert. My role as a scholar and a teacher, because my conclusions differ from theirs, because my starting position, which is rooted in principles of love and of human equality and of equal rights, is in direct conflict with their beliefs in racialized forms of capitalism and nationalism. And what we see with all of these critiques, all of these smears, is that they don't rely on substance, right? And so they bring forward these various strategies to attack, to marginalize, to isolate me, but don't ever really contend with the points that I and so many others are making. These smears come from a range of people, as an academic, they come from community members, religious leaders, the press, parents, and even sometimes, unfortunately, students. So here you can see a group of Wake Forest students, including one who was my student at one point, holding up signs at a campus event saying Barry Trachtenberg does not represent us. I'm sorry, the quality of this particular image isn't particularly strong. Um, but what unites these critics is that they are acting on behalf of state interests, the maintenance of power, and they believe that my voice, because of my positionality and my refusal following Edward Said's admonition to never serve the interests of the state, threatens their hold on power and their identities, which are so intimately tied to that power. So I'm beginning with these attacks not because they're exceptional by any means, and many, probably most of my colleagues who have been critical of Israel's assault on Palestinians or who speak up for the rights of transgender people, who advocate for the full equality of women, of people of color, people who are perceived to be disabled, and queer people, have experienced these sorts of attacks. Rather, I bring them forward in a way to show how ubiquitous they are as a strategy that is used to circumvent scholarly debate or even conversations in the public sphere. So instead of engaging in actual debate, where these critics would have to justify Israel's settler colonial past, its violent appropriation of Palestinian land, the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians at the founding of the country, the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, the apartheid system that sustains it, and the genocide that's been ongoing since October 2023, right? They would rather smear us. The recent attacks on the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism that have appeared from Canary Mission and more recently from the Anti-Defamation League, for example, have to be understood in this light. Rather than actually engage in critical debates, they are choosing tactics that have a long history with authoritarian regimes whose power rests upon their willingness to engage in violence and brutality rather on the will of the people they govern. These organizations, I argue, are mirroring the very violence of the states on whose behalf they are acting. Because not only are they calling for the exclusion, marginalization, and excommunication of those of us with whom they object, they're also willing to overturn many of the civil protections and rights that underline our society, such as the right to free speech, of due process, the right to assemble, to be protected from unwanted searches and seizures, and even to have the religious freedom to be, as so many of us are, anti-Zionist Jews. These are the mechanisms of fascism and authoritarianism. They were adopted by the Nazis in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and they are adopted by Zionists today. As a scholar of Jewish history and the Nazi Holocaust, I find myself profoundly disturbed when I observe and experience the same strategies used today on behalf of those advocating for the genocidal violence, for an end to the genocidal violence against Palestinians. So, as Emmaia said, my expertise is in the Nazi Holocaust and in Jewish history. And so what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is sort of talk about how these smear tactics worked in the Nazi period. Right? Um, the Nazi efforts to smear its opponents started almost immediately at the emergence of National Socialism. The Nazis after World War I just tried to define themselves as the true Germans and attacked those, both with smears and physical violence, who it deemed as a threat to the German race and its new state building project. What they had to do was to convince the German people that Jews represented an existential threat, meaning biological, cultural, economic, and a security threat to the German nation, which had just been defeated and humiliated in the Great War. Now, at the very beginning of the Nazi Party, they released a 25-point plan, which is really quite a fascinating document because it guides much of the Nazi program until its defeat in 1945. Some of the key points of this were insisting on defining the German nation in very narrowly racialized terms to exclude Jews who were defined as being part of a competing race. It also insisted on its right to colonize non-German peoples, to call for the expulsion of non-Germans from the state itself, from also the press, from artistic, cultural productions, from the economy. And it also included subtle attacks on people with disabilities by championing physical fitness as essential to the health of the race. Now, how this party platform was manifested before the Nazis came into power in 1933 was through street violence, often against Jews, communists, socialists, social democrats, manifested itself in targeted assassinations, attacking union halls, assaults on Jewish businesses, and really with intense propaganda that marked all of their opponents as enemies of the people and as a profound threat to the nation. The goal was to humiliate their opponents. Then they used excessive force and sometimes tried to work through the ballot box as well. Now, after the Nazis came to power, sorry, I'm trying to advance my slides here. They're not going. Oops, I see what I did. There you go. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, a couple of years later, they released something known as the Nuremberg laws. Now, these were the laws that defined who was an Aryan and who was a Jew based on their racial ancestry, which was then also tied to their religious beliefs of their grandparents. And the goal for much of this was to help foster a racial panic. And what we see in the aftermath of this, Jews were legally stripped of the protections of citizenship. And now it gave the state the formal right to expel Jews from all aspects of German society where they remained. And the focus of this was much on the academy, on the place of Jews in government, on business. Foreign Jews had to be expelled. And then eventually, prior to mid 1941, the goal was, eventually the goal was to get rid of all of these unwanted groups by forced emigration. So there's enormous amounts of forced deportation that was occurring. After mid 1941, the policy moves towards extermination, with which I think we're quite familiar. I should also want to note that many of these policies weren't directed only at Jews, but at other groups as well, very often on people who were perceived to be disabled by the state. The Nazis adopted this term that had come from the 1920s called Lebensunwertes Leben, basically declaring that there were people whose lives were not worthy of the life that they had. And so you can see with this image on the right, this says daily 5.5 Reichmarks are used for a disabled person. These same 5.5 marks could be sustain like a healthy family for a single day, right? And then you can see these other images here, which really sort of put forward these ideas of the health of the German people. I find the image of the young girl really quite disconcerting because it says, I also belong to the Fuhrer, right? So that's she's sort of giving her body up, right, to the Fuhrer. So with all of these groups who are targeted for expulsion or disappearance in one way or another by the regime, right, they use the smears of metaphors of disease, of vermin, of parasites, and they tried to make the case that Jews and other minoritized people were fundamentally foreign to the state itself. They had to be discredited, isolated, humiliated, and ultimately expelled and eradicated. Now, during the Holocaust itself, the goal of the state then became they had to convince Germans to support the mass slaughter that was underway. The mass killing of Jews was not something that was a massive state secret. It was known throughout the regime, and the Germans were very sensitive to public opinion, so they invested enormous amounts of energy trying to convince Germans that Jews were a fundamentally foreign people, that they were not part of German society, and that they posed this existential threat. Now, one of the ways they did this was by attaching film crews to various SS units. And so, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was home to as many as 500,000 Jews who were confined there, they sent in film crews to make movies that were then shown back in Germany, trying to portray Jews in these very stereotypical ways. So here you can see they dressed up Jews in religious garb and forced them to pray. On the right, they showed that Jews are gambling. You can see the armbands on the Jews here to show that they're in the ghetto. And we know that this is the case both because we have the films and we can see some of the images of the film crews in some of those movies, but also we have a large number of testimonies by inmates of the ghetto themselves who are writing diaries and memoirs talking about the film crews coming in dressing up Jews in various ways as gamblers, as prostitutes, as thieves, as beggars, and then using the tactics of modern movie making in order to create these films that would then be shown back as these propaganda pieces, right? So the goal in part was to make the German people disgusted enough by Jews to justify their mass killing. I think it's also really important to remember that this violence, which is so patently offensive, was always framed as a defensive strategy to justify the self-protection of the group that was committing the violence. Because the Nazis saw this violence as necessary for their people to live. The arguments that they were making was that all Jews anywhere were a threat to the German people, which is why they sought to eradicate Jews not just from Germany, but from all of the territories they conquered. Whether they were of fighting age, elderly, or newborns, their very existence seemed to pose a threat. And so today we see the same Nazi logic continuing among white supremacists. The violence of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally or the Tree of Life massacre, or even in the January 6th coup attempt, were often framed somehow as defenses against white genocide. And it allows these groups to deny what they're doing, to depict themselves as the threatened minority, and to justify any acts of violence against their targets because they're made in the name of self-defense. So having studied this and taught this for many, many years, for me, it's been terrifying to see that so many of these same strategies are now being used against activists, against scholars, against our students who have been speaking out against the genocide that Palestinians are facing. Now, I'm not trying to say that Zionists are Nazis or Nazis are Zionists. Now, as a scholar of both groups, I find it reductive and inflammatory. And it also continues really quite a harmful practice of viewing Nazi behavior as a sort of a yardstick by which we measure all other acts of violence. Rather, I think it's important to recognize the parallels that exist between these two different projects, and indeed in any project that is rooted in racial supremacist ideologies. Both projects, both Nazism and Zionism, justify eliminationist violence based on notions of existential threats to their people. Both engage in acts of violence against largely civilian populations whose very existence is framed as threatening to their societal vision of a racially pure state. Both projects attack their critics from within their communities as internal threats, which require eradicating them, and not as internal and legitimate critics who identify as members of the community. Unfortunately, there's a long history of smear tactics by Zionist groups against their critics. What we saw almost immediately after the First World War, that groups like the Anti-Defamation League, as Emmaia knows, I think very well, that they began to attack Arab organizations for their criticism of the Zionist project that was underway in Palestine. There's this new book that's come out in the last couple of years by Jeffrey Levin, which goes into this in some detail, called Our Palestine Question. These groups in the immediate aftermath of World War II began to try to argue for a chain of anti-Semitism between German Nazis and Palestinian Arabs. These groups began to try to paint anti-Zionists or critics of Zionism with the same Nazi brush. And this behavior continued. So even as the American Jewish community in the decades after World War II is still sort of sorting out its relationship with Israel and the ideology of Zionism, critics that advocates for Israel began attacking their critics sort of with these merciless smear tactics. We saw, for example, how Noam Chomsky, as early as 1970, began speaking out on behalf of Palestinian rights and really beginning to demand that other leftists stop ignoring the crisis, and immediately started to become targeted by major Jewish organizations. We're familiar with the rhetoric of the self-hating Jew, the capo accusations, like which were made at me in one of the early slides of the show. And the underlying framework, so much of this became that anti-Zionist Jews in particular were race traitors, that they're people who betrayed their people because of their criticism of Zionism, just as allegedly Jewish capos had betrayed their people during the Holocaust. Now, this has gone on for a very long time, but it really began to be intensified significantly after October 7th. What we saw is that Israel's genocidal response to the violence of October 7th has both heightened these strategies of smearing, but also, I think, in some ways have revealed their weaknesses. We saw, for example, in the immediate aftermath, the widespread demonization of Palestinians, of Muslims, of people from Middle Eastern backgrounds, as well as their supporters, very often using the same language that we were all too familiar with in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks that occurred. But at the same time, because the movement for Palestinian rights was so strong, we also began to almost immediately start to see the targeting of scholars and activists who advocated for Palestinian humanity. There were specific campaigns against the Institute, against Jewish Voice for Peace, Palestine Legal, and other groups by organizations like Canary Mission, the Anti-Defamation League, Beitar, the Amcha Initiative, and so many others. And now, of course, we're in this moment where we have these very well documented cases of student activists who are being smeared as anti-Semitic for their involvement in encampments, for calling for ceasefire, for calling for divestment. It's estimated now that as many as 1,300 students and scholars have had their visas revoked as of last week. So 1,300 already. At the same time, we're also seeing the targeting of scholars in so many ways. So our dear colleague Rababa Al-Duhadi has been the target of a number of smear campaigns, not only unfortunately on my campus, but at other places as well. Our colleague and friend Maura Finkelstein, who lost her position at Muhlenberg College for speaking out on behalf of Palestinian human rights. Roz Siegel, a historian at Stockton State College, who's one of the first to call out the genocide for what it was, lost a job at Minnesota leading a genocide studies program. And all of these denials and firings accelerated a process that began, of course, much earlier. We saw this with Stephen Salaida, his job being pulled from Urbana-Champaign, Norman Finkelstein, several years ago, had his tenure denied at DePaul universities. But now we're even seeing that entire universities are being smeared as anti-Semitic. Harvard, Columbia, we're seeing programs being dismantled. In addition to this, Arab civil rights organizations are being deemed unpatriotic and terroristic, and specifically Jewish anti-Zionist organizations as traitorous. So I'm going to end this pretty brief talk by just trying to make 2 points here. One is that in all of these smear campaigns, I think they're also revealing some of their weaknesses. And I think the reality is that because they don't have the facts and the evidence on their side, they have to resort to these strategies. Right? I think we need to recognize that the trend is moving against these organizations, which is why they are going on such an attack and why they are relying upon such sort of wretched, unethical strategies to attack their opponents. They don't have the facts on their side. They don't have the evidence on their side. As more and more groups are denouncing this genocide, what we are seeing is that public polling is increasing against Israel within the Jewish community. There's a major shift away from support for Israel that is occurring, away from supporting Israel's assault on Palestinians. We're even seeing in the last week or so groups like the Anti-Defamation League taking small steps backwards, now pretending to care about due process, when weeks ago they were celebrating the abduction of pro-Palestinian activists. So I just want to end with a reminder that they fear us, hence these attacks. I know that many of us, including myself, at times are quite scared in this moment. And I know there's that instinct, I think, for us to hide. But we have to remember that they're coming after us because we represent a threat to them, because we name their violence for what it is, because we refuse to back down, because we refuse to let them define us as anything other than we are. And because we refuse to have our solidarities be compromised by racism, nationalism, and other forms of division. And then also, finally, because we at the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism are dedicated to interrogating the exploitative, racist, colonialist, sexist, classist systems that their power rests upon and has always been reliant upon. So thank you. Stop there. You are muted, Emmaia. Oh.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we don't. There's a mandatory mute in effect right now. So, thank you so much, Barry. It's really powerful to be able to draw from this history. Especially, I was thinking as you were speaking that so often the ways that we are invited to think about Nazism and to think about Holocaust tactics feel instrumentalized in support of Zionism. And it's really so freeing to be able to have a historical conversation about it where we're actually talking about what happened, and not feeling like we're being sort of drawn into to a compulsion to support Zionism as a result. I want to invite people to put their questions in the chat. I'm going to start with some questions, and maybe they'll fold in your questions as well. And Yulia, maybe you can pin Barry back. I don't know. I can't tell if that's happened or not. So one thing that, as you mentioned, one thing that is happening right now is that Zionist organizations in the United States are kind of being required to negotiate their relationship to Trump era fascism. So taking the Anti-Defamation League as an example, right? The ADL has been demanding of universities for a long time. I mean, we could say starting with the launch of the campaign for the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which equates anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So that was started around 2016. You might say that's the beginning of when the ADL really started calling on universities to criminalize the critique of Israel. And now that they have succeeded in doing that, and over the last year throughout the genocide, continually invoked brutal policing of students, et cetera, and demanding policies from universities, now those policies exist. And so now students who criticize Israel or who insist on protesting genocide are actually violating rules, and that has allowed them to be criminalized, right? And in fact, we saw this morning at the University of Michigan, we saw images of the FBI having been called in by the Michigan Attorney General, breaking down the doors of the homes of student organizers. So we can
without a warrant, right?
What? Without a warrant. It's really a testament to the power of documenting what's happening to you on video, actually. So anyway, we're in this moment where the power of Zionist organizations' characterization of Palestine solidarity work has really material consequences, right? And as a result, we're seeing Zionist organizations, the Anti-Defamation League being among them, also Deborah Lipstadt, the most recent anti-Semitism czar, sort of walking it back a little bit and saying, well, yes, do this crackdown, but also could you make it a little bit more legal, and trying to negotiate their place in relation to fascism. I know you know this. What I want to ask is if you can pull from the history of Nazi smear tactics and their direct relationship to that kind of violence that you're talking about, and tell us what kind of moment of negotiation might we look at in that context? I mean, I'll ask, I don't want to talk too much, but my understanding is, and this is not my area of study, that, similar to what's happening here and in any case where there's a fascist regime sort of taking shape, organizations, Jewish organizations, and other organizations tried to figure out what their relationship was going to be to Nazism, right? And my understanding is that there was some interest among, like more conservative or upper class Jewish organizations in like not intervening, right? Because for whatever reason, either because Nazis were targeting their political opponents, or because they were trying to preserve their ability to fight. I wonder if you can just sort of help us think about this moment of negotiating with fascism or trying to figure out what your relationship.
Yeah, I can. I think the case study is probably more, this question is perhaps more applicable to the case in Italy that occurred. So, Mussolini comes into power in 1922, and the new fascist party is not an anti-Semitic party. It is open to Jews. It does not have a racist element at the outset. It is very much working to sort of crack down on socialist and on communist organizing, against union organizing. But by the late 1930s, the Mussolini regime began to insist on new racial laws and eventually adopted many Nazi policies for themselves. And there is where you have this moment, I think, where many Jews who had fully embraced the fascist movement, who saw, that fascism aligned with their values, or in a way they were sort of fellow travelers, they maybe were Jews who were of some means, who were sort of happy with the new law and order regime, all of a sudden found themselves on the outs of it. But in both cases, both in Nazi Germany or in pre-Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy, you have really a range of responses, by Jews to the regime. But it's my sense that the strategies of many Jewish organizations were less to accommodate the Nazi regimes, but to hope that they could stay hidden and that the violence wouldn't affect them, right? And so what they did was they retreated. They sought to just stay quiet, to not cause any fuss. They actually sought to convince others to not rebel. You have, leaders of the German Jewish Committee trying to convince activist Jews in the United States to not boycott Germany because out of fear that, they would feel the consequences of it. And they hoped they would just be able to ride the violence out. And what that meant, of course, was that they were hidden. And, as I posted following a conversation that you and I were having, is that when we retreat, it gives the fascists more room to operate. And I think we see that in that situation. And this is why, in part, I think that it's really sort of up to us to be pushing forward. In this moment, anti-Semitism is functioning in a very different way than it was in the 1930s, I think, at one level, where anti-Semitism is being weaponized against non-Jews rather than against Jews. Anti-Semitism is being the fight against anti-Semitism is being used to prop up a state rather than to protect a people. And what we're seeing, of course, is that the very people who are weaponizing anti-Semitism in the administration are white supremacists. They're not doing this at all out of love for the Jewish people or care and concern for the humanity of Jews. They're doing it because it's an effective tool. And I think that major Jewish organizations, that Jewish Zionist organizations are playing an incredibly dangerous game by aligning themselves, by allowing themselves to be utilized in this way, by participating in this weaponization of anti-Semitism. Because as we know from the Nazi experiences, we know from the Italian experiences, we know from the experience of so many authoritarian regimes, like it doesn't stop, once they attack one person, it keeps expanding and expanding. And if at the root of this current regime are white nationalists, ultimately that's going to come and get all of us.
There we go. Sorry. um, I will stop muting myself. Um, I just want to clarify, there's a question in the chat. Did Dr. Abdulhadi support or smear you? Dr. Abdulhadi is a part of our community, and Barry brought Rabab to North Carolina to speak, and both she and Barry took a lot of abuse for that. Just to clarify.
Sorry if I wasn't clear during the talk. Yeah, my university canceled a talk by Dr. Abdulhadi, so we had it off campus and were able to get more people than in the space they allotted us if we had been on campus. So they lost.
I want to go back to the discussion that you were presenting of staging violence, or I mean, okay, so what you were actually showing is not staging violence, but staging sort of otherness, using the medium of film and, no Instagram and Nazi Germany, but using that sort of mass image production in order to racialize people. In the world of American studies, where I come from, one of the sort of elements of racialization that like people are, that's part of conversation, is the constant production of images of people being subjected to police violence, right? So like, during the civil rights movement, the constant images of like people being beaten or attacked with dogs, on the one hand, were, they were news images, like you don't want to not have them. On the other hand, the constant repetition of seeing like identifiably Black people being identifiably brutalized was itself a way of marking Blackness as a sort of outside identity. And there's a question in the chat that I think is worth sort of bringing into this, which is, so far in the context of Palestine protest, the deportations, the police brutality seems to have been directed primarily at Palestinians and students of people of color. There is to some extent like the inclusion of anti-Zionist Jews in there, but it's not necessarily so visible. So the question is, what is the work of not just hate mail and smear, but also of this constant production of the spectacle of state violence against a set of people? And does it have any parallels in that like sort of Nazi film genre?
I think it does. I mean, I think what happens is that constant repetition, depending on who's doing it and for what reasons in some ways. But those images can either be used to protest the acts that are going on, but I think very often they're also used to celebrate state power itself, that they serve the function of normalizing this kind of violence, that it portrays the victims of that violence as somehow criminals and therefore deserving of this. So for people who tend to believe in the state, who tend to believe in the police, who believe in law and order as necessary to run a civil society, seeing people portrayed as criminals criminalizes those people. And so this was very much what the Nazis sought to do by portraying images of Jews as helpless, as weak. It helped to reinforce these notions that Jews were not a people about whom Germans should extend their notion of humanity towards, right? They should disidentify with these people, even if it was people who at one time were their neighbors, their friends, their partners. But seeing images again and again of Jews as these helpless figures in these degraded positions where they're starved or they're brutalized or they're begging in the street help to reduce their humanity in a way, right? And so I think a lot of it has to do with the gaze, right? And so one of the things that we talk a lot about in my field in Holocaust studies is the fact that almost every image that any of us have ever seen about the Holocaust was taken by the perpetrators, right? So think of that image of the little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up. Think about, images of Jews in striped pajamas and things. It's always taken by the perpetrators themselves, right? So they're the ones who are sometimes going in with film crews and setting up scenes. Sometimes it is soldiers taking trophy photos of scenes of mass violence. Sometimes it's images of masses of Jews who are in death pits where they've been killed. And it's almost all of it. And so there's very few photos that we have that are actually taken by the victims of the Holocaust themselves. And when those do appear, they're very, very different photos. So for example, there's four famous photos that were taken in Auschwitz by prisoners to show the violence that was happening. And the intent of those photos was so different, right? They're blurry, they're kind of hard to make out, they're not staged. They were clear, and you can tell by the photos themselves that they were done in the shadows, not posed, not done in a way to sort of valorize the violence that's going on, but to expose it. So I think whenever we look at these kinds of image, we have to be aware of who's behind the camera and what is the intention of those images, and not forget that the vast majority are going to be taken by those who are conducting the violence itself.
Thanks. I'm going to pull two questions from the chat here. The question is, are there any cases of violent retaliation toward Jewish critics of Zionism that we can point to? There's also the question of what do we define as violent, which I think is a useful question. And then I'll add to that the question of what is it, to the extent that this is racial violence that we're talking about, we're talking about a white nationalist violence that is intended to sort of exclude and mark people as other. What does it mean to have both a focus on Palestinians and people of color and a focus on anti-Zionist Jews in this violence? Does it change? Does it mean that it's not racial violence? Does it change how you're thinking about it?
It's very much racialized violence, because I think when it is violence that is being directed at Palestinians, at most activists who are people of color, who we've seen, I think it's really quite clearly that it is part of this project of white supremacy that we see. I mean, of the 1,400 people who've had their visas denied, I mean, the vast majority are people who are coming from Middle Eastern countries. There's no doubt about that, to my mind. I think when the violence it happens against, and we could talk about what we mean by violence, if we mean just sort of, physical assaults, if we mean violence that is done through acts of smearing, through just destruction of professional reputations, through doxing, right? I mean, to my mind, these are all sort of on a spectrum of violence. When it happens against people who are identified as white, who identify themselves as Jewish, I think it's a different kind of violence, but it's also very much racialized violence because it's very often directed against people who are disavowing the whiteness that is ascribed to them in society. There are people who are activist out of an anti-racist agenda. And so this is where you get this idea of anti-Zionist Jews who are being called race traitors, right? Who are capos, who are, people who are going against the interests of their particular group. So I think we see it constantly. I think it's very much tied to these projects of white supremacy, even when it's Jews who are advocating the violence, because when it is the violence is coming from Jewish organizations, it's because they're advocating a Zionism, which is a project of white supremacy. It's from its very, very origins until this present day, it is rooted in those settler colonial practices that come out of the European imperial history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Herzl himself very, very famously said, the reason why, Zionism will be good for Europeans is because they'll serve as a bulwark against the barbarian nations of the world.
I'll just add to that also, as you were speaking, I was realizing like actually every every police raid of every campus has been violence against Jews, right? Like it has that is not the sort of front and center narrative, but because the movement is like involves so many Jews, the
Yeah.
there is an enormous amount of violence against Jews, and particularly the UCLA vigilante attack, which was orchestrated both by Zionists and like MAGA white guys, um, was also an attack, like a very specific attack on Jews who disagreed. But because the attacks are initiated by Jewish organizations, they're often not even understood to have Jews on the other end of them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have two more questions for you. One will maybe two we'll pull from the chat. Historically, what was the like were these arguments about anti-Semitism applied to anti-Zionist Jews before the establishment of the state? And I guess that sort of leads to a question of how is Zionism transforming itself in response to the sort of invitation of white nationalist power that the Trump regime presents?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. We should talk that one through. But to the first question again, remind me, sorry.
The question is, were pre-state anti-Zionist Jews marked as anti-Semitic?
Much rarely so. You certainly saw that type of rhetoric that was used by revisionist Zionists, by right-wing Zionists, and you saw it to some extent by Zionists who were very much based in Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s. But they weren't necessarily using the language of anti-Semitism. They were very, the Zionism was very much a minority movement among Jewry writ large prior to World War II. It was a growing movement. The numbers are increasing in many places, but for a lot of people, Zionism was sort of this side project that maybe they supported, but they weren't necessarily invested in. For the vast majority of American Jews, there was a sense that Zionism would be useful for impoverished Jews who were living in, the poorer parts of the world, but not really for them who had made it, in America. You also have within the European context out of which Zionism stems, you have a very strong Jewish workers' rights movement, who are arguing for revolutionary change, arguing for socialist revolution, for communist revolution. You also have in Europe among more middle-class Jews, many of whom just were seeking to find a place for themselves within the various nation states that had emerged in the decades before World War II. So you have large numbers of Jews in Poland who were identifying as, Polish Jews. Many German Jews were Germans of the Jewish faith. So too in England, so too in France. And so the idea that they would somehow give up that identity in order to move somewhere else in the earth and then live in an exclusively Jewish society was something that was really quite unimaginable to them. And so when they would be in opposition to Zionism, the argument wasn't that they were being anti-Semitic. It's that, they were choosing the wrong path, that they weren't sort of understanding the writing on the wall, that they weren't caring about their own people. And so the second part of the question, sorry.
Second part of the question, which is much bigger, is how given so we're talking about a Zionism as something that has transformed itself even from the point that you were talking about where it was a minority movement and sort of an instinct about what to do. How do we see it transforming itself further given kind of the invitations that white supremacy and white Christian nationalism offer it now?
I think what we're seeing with Zionism is that for a very long time, Zionism was propped up by this liberal myth that Israel was a democratic society, that it was open to all Jews around the world, that it only engaged in violence when absolutely necessary and only in a defensive posture, and that it was a democratic Western project at the very heart of it. And you have this project of liberal Zionism who regretted the territories, regretted the maltreatment of Palestinians, and who thought by reforms, right, so a gradual process of reforms, they could fulfill the promise of Israel as a safe space for Jews in the world in which Jews would be, one nation of people among many people in the world. And thus anti-Semitism would sort of disappear as a result. What liberal Zionists, of course, always ignored was the violence that rested at the very, very core of the project and was necessary for the project to begin and to be maintained all throughout. And many walls were shattered, I think, on October 7th. And I think the myth of liberal Zionism, also really crumbled in this moment, because what we see is that the eliminationist components of Zionism that were present at the fore have that were sort of at the core of it, but often sort of restrained and had this liberal veneer, like that liberal veneer is gone. And we're really seeing the true face of what Zionism is, that it is a project of settler colonial violence that is only sustained by apartheid practices, that it requires mass killing in order to be maintained. And so I think Zionism is not something that sort of quaint liberals can sort of be strong advocates for in the way that they used to. They have to defend it now increasingly because the violence that's inherent has just been so exposed.
Thanks. I'm going to pose one more question.
Yeah.
And then there are other questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat. So I'm not sure what to do about them, but good question.
I will happily put my email in the chat. And if people want to write to me, they are welcome to.
Thank you. All right. Well, I will put your email in the chat in a minute.
Okay.
Just you listen to the question. Oh, you got it. Okay.
Sure.
So the last question I want to ask you is, so we're talking about the material power of smear and the particular way that it has material power in a fascist moment, in a fascist system. So I want to ask you about that. Like, so what do you understand to be the material, or maybe even parallels if you want to? I know we're not making samenesses, right, between Zionism and Nazism, but like, what do we learn from Nazism about how smear becomes a force for moving capital, for changing the circumstances of people's lives, for transferring power upward, for undoing democratic ways of being? And then I'll put the question from the chat, which is, what are the strategies for resisting the way that smear does that?
Yeah. You set me up with this question earlier today. And so I've been trying to kind of think it through a bit. I mean, what we're seeing with the sort of the smear of anti-Semitism that's being used is, in this particular moment, it is being used to transform many of the structures that have sort of propped up aspects of our society, in particular the academy. And maybe I'm thinking about the academy in particular because that's where I reside. But the Trump administration, sort of using the pretense of anti-Semitism, is trying to dismantle higher education in this moment. Right? I mean, it's with attacks on Harvard, with attacks on Columbia, with the threats to the NEH, to the NIH, to all these organizations. I mean, they're constantly weaponizing anti-Semitism, not because they care at all about the safety of Jewish people, but because in this particular moment, it's a very effective tool, much in the way that they are using the attacks on transgendered people. Also to pull funding from institutions. I think, is it Penn State or University of Pennsylvania, where enormous sums are being pulled because of transgendered athletes who are still competing. And so they're weaponizing the funding in this way. And so this is where we're seeing, I think, some of the real material consequences of this. And this is, undoing these institutions, some of which have been around for hundreds of years in this moment. And again, it's not because they care about protecting Jews. It's because they want to dismantle these institutions in particular, because it's in these institutions where their power and their corrupt ideologies on which their power resides can be named, it can be studied, it can be interrogated. And because these universities have been sites of resistance for so many decades. So I think as a way to talk about resisting it really quickly is it we have to recognize that we need to be pushing back, right? So we need to be pushing our leaders of our institutions, whether we are faculty in them, students in them, alumni members of them, community members who turn to them for some time or another, to stand up and resist this, right? What we know from the Nazi period, what we know from the period of Italian fascism, what we know from the worst periods of the Soviet Union is that they are very, very attuned to public opinion. We see this very clearly with Trump, where he puts forward a set of really egregious policies and then has to pull back because the outcry is too great. So it absolutely behooves all of us to be creating an outcry as much as possible in order to resist this, to not back down, to not give them any room to advance. And I think for those of us who are not as vulnerable as some of the people who have already been targeted for abduction and deportation, there's an extra burden on us to be speaking out, to use whatever privilege that we have because of our positionality to be speaking out against these atrocities that are occurring in our name.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end. We have to resist. We have to expose. Do what Barry did and put your hate mail on slides. The Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is actually launching a hate mail archive to do exactly what you're talking about, Barry, where we want to take seriously the ideology and the meaning and the sort of openness to like use racism and use misogyny and use anti-trans messaging to do that work. So I put the link in the chat to the page where we are sort of gathering this study. I invite you to have a look at what we're doing to figure out how you can contribute. And Barry put his email in there so you can send Barry your questions. That was bold of you to put your email. Appreciate you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Barry, for your knowledge and your insight and your generosity as usual.